expensive. I think they were a little bit more back then. I think the ringside seats might have been $25. But you know, there was, you know, of course, Vern Gagne. He was the big draw. But other guys, you know, when I first started going to see this stuff back in the early well, I'd say 70, 72, 73, 74. In that time frame, you had guys like Superstar Graham had a run there in the AWA at that time. Wahoo McDaniel, of course the famous Crusher, who was a mainstay there. But there was, and then of course, two guys that were probably I didn't know it at the time, but two guys that would wind up being my favorites were a couple guys the name of Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens. Now, didn't at the time because I was just a kid and I still believed in wrestling. And let me tell you something, I believe pro wrestling was real a lot longer than I believed in Santa Claus. So I know the disappointment. You know, it was kind of a disappointment when I really realized it and figured it out for myself that this was all fake. This was all, you know, predetermined and whatnot. I probably wasn't until the late 70s that I really realized that this stuff was staged, and it was kind of a letdown. It really was. I mean, because back then there was none of this sports entertainment stuff that Vince tries to, you know, from the WWE tries to throw at you now. Wrestling back then, promoters like Ghanaians in particular, they did a good job of protecting what's called kayfabe, or basically protecting the storyline. The wrestlers, you know, the good guys and the bad guys never mingled with each other. You never. They did a fabulous job of protecting that image. So when I discovered that wrestling was fake, I can't say that I lost interest in it. If anything, what it did, it made me more curious about the inner workings, about what went on backstage, and about how things were predetermined, and how what it took for some wrestlers to get what they call pushes and what have you. One of the things that made me, as I grew older and discovered that wrestling was indeed a work, and it made me appreciate what some of these guys actually went through. It actually made me appreciate what some of the quote-unquote heels go through. And going back to one of my favorites was at the time were again Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens. Ray Stevens was doing some research on him. Ray Stevens, who passed away a number of years ago, he was a hard-nosed, he was a legitimate tough guy, excuse me, who got involved in not only professional wrestling, but was also into rodeo. I believe he was also into stock car racing. So the man was a legitimate tough guy, a hard worker, and he did a good job of doing his job was to make people dislike him, and he did a fabulous job at that. And I'm sad to see, you know, so when he passed away back a few years ago, it was really a sad thing to find out about. Two other guys, you know, and I mentioned Bockwinkel. Bockwinkel was another one who he could draw more heat and get more people to just hate his guts, not by his actions in the ring, as much as just the way he carried on in his interviews, this pompous, silver-tongued, it's funny. They say that wrestling is a redneck soap opera, and if that's the case, well, then Nick Bockwinkel played the villain, the silver-tongued, spoken words that us rednecks would never understand. Looking back at some of his old promos, he was great at doing what he did, and that was to get the people to absolutely hate him. And I think it was when he was getting towards the tail end of his career, I think it was a great tribute to him that they actually put him in a role as a face or as a good guy, so he could actually get the adoration of the fans who he deserved it. The guy was absolutely a phenomenal worker, and I'm glad that WWE recognized him last year and put him into the Hall of Fame, even though he never wrestled a lick for WWE. I think it was great they put him in the Hall of Fame. And talk about one of Bockwinkel's other accomplices at the time was, I'm sure anybody that's watched wrestling at all knows who he is, Bobby Heenan, Bobby the Brain, or Bobby the Weasel. My God, could this guy make you hate him in so many different words. He didn't have that same vocabulary that Bockwinkel had. But you know something, he just, the word, words like humanoid. Now, I don't know if, I think Bockwinkel actually came up with that first, but he took and ran with it. And he was another one, though. Heenan could just get you fired up. He'd do it in more than, being that he was a manager. Heenan could not only get you fired up by his interviews, but his actions in the ring could also get you fired up. And the way he would, the way he would interfere for his wrestlers, or if he'd get caught and one of the wrestlers would drag him into the ring, this guy was taking bumps, hard bumps, back before it was a popular thing to do. One of the things that I remember him doing, now I understand this has also been attributed to Ray Stevens somewhat, but he'd let himself get whipped into the corner. Instead of just taking the turnbuckle, head on or whatever, he'd do a complete 360 flip back first into the turnbuckle. Ouch. And this was back in the days before wrestlers were